Good evening, dear listener, and welcome to Audio Classic Detective, your home for refined mystery and masterful deduction. Here we revive the golden age of crime fiction where every motive is masked, every alibi tested, and only the keenest minds prevail. So settle in, brew a proper cup of tea, and prepare for clever crimes and even cleverer solutions. The investigation is about to begin. Get comfortable, and let's begin. It was on a Thursday morning that the villagers of Little Darnsley learned of Mr. Ambrose Rycroft's passing. A solitary figure in both temperament and trade, Mr. Rycroft had lived above his clockmaker's shop for more than 4 decades, repairing timepieces with a precision that bordered on reverence. The village had grown used to the rhythmic sound of ticking that spilled from his open window, a metronome to the sleepy comings and goings of life in the high street. His apprentice, a nervous lad named Edwin Flett, had been the one to find him, slumped in his chair beside an unfinished carriage clock. A cup of tea, half spilled and cold, sat precariously at the edge of the workbench. The constable, summoned more from tradition than alarm, declared it a natural death. Mr. Rycroft had been in his 70s after all, alone, and of that peculiar breed who prefers the company of mechanisms to men. Miss Marple, visiting the village to see her niece's friend recovering from illness, was among the first to express polite condolences. But as was her custom, she noticed rather more than she let on. The cup was chipped, freshly so, and there was a faint streak along the floorboards, as if something heavy had been dragged. No one mentioned a visitor, and yet there had been a faint scent of lavender water in the air, quite foreign to the masculine sense of oil and metal that otherwise clung to the place. It was a peaceful death by all accounts. And yet, to Miss Marple's well-tuned instincts, there was something ever so slightly discordant in the whole affair. Like a clock whose tick had suddenly faltered, a note just off-key enough to unsettle. The news, though not shocking in itself, travelled with all the gentle urgency of a teapot being passed around at a vicarage garden party. Mr. Rycroft had not been popular, precisely, but he was respected. A man of rigid habits and few words, he had been a fixture in Little Darnsley, as much a part of its identity as the church bell or the postmistress's tabby cat. By the time the midday deliveries had arrived, half the village knew he had died, and the other half knew the clock shop was closed indefinitely. Speculation, always the village's favorite pastime, turned its attention to matters of inheritance. Had he left anything behind? Was there a will? And what of his family? Someone recalled a brother, long deceased, a niece in Canada perhaps, but no one knew for certain. Miss Marple, seated discreetly near the baker's window, listened with the kind of attention that was neither intrusive nor idle. There was, she observed, a curious tension beneath the mourning, an air of expectancy, not grief, but curiosity, as though Mr. Rycroft's death had not ended something, but begun it. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple called upon the constable, under the pretense of returning a borrowed church newsletter. Their conversation, innocuous on the surface, meandered naturally to the subject of Mr. Rycroft. The constable, a practical man with little use for fanciful notions, reiterated the findings. No signs of forced entry, no struggle, nothing disturbed, save for the workshop's usual chaos. Yet Miss Marple's attention lingered on the broken cup, not the stain it had left, but the clean fracture in the porcelain, sharp, recent, and suggestive of a sudden motion. It had not merely fallen. Someone had gripped it tightly enough to snap the handle before dropping it in haste. She also noted the faint scuff near the entrance, where the polish on the floorboards was dulled in a perfect dark. A chair had been moved, or a heavy object dragged. And there was the matter of the scent. Lavender water, subtle but unmistakable, still clinging to the air by the stairwell. Not a fragrance Mr. Rycroft would ever have worn, and most peculiar of all, no one had seen a visitor that day. But someone had come. That much Miss Marple was quite certain of. 2 days later the solicitor arrived, a Mr. Gibbons from Bexhill, known for his orderly moustache and somewhat disorderly paperwork. After making the necessary introductions and accepting a dry bun from the vicar's wife, he addressed the gathered villagers with the solemnity of a man unaccustomed to drama but prepared, if pressed, to tolerate it. Mr. Rycroft, he explained, had left behind no formal will. No heir had come forward, and aside from a modest savings account and the property itself, the only notable item was an elaborate grandfather clock, sealed and inexplicably empty of its mechanical workings. The face was beautifully carved, the pendulum case locked. Yet there was no ticking, no rhythm, no key. It had stood in the back room of the shop for decades, largely unnoticed. When the constable, at Mr. Gibbons' request, had finally pried open the panel, they found nothing inside. No gears, no weights, only a hollow cavity, and a single phrase etched into the wood behind the face. "The truth ticks in silence." Miss Marple, who had been listening politely from the edge of the room, tilted her head just so. She had seen many a grandfather clock in her day, some working, some broken, some merely decorative. But she had never seen one so deliberately empty. It was, in its own quiet way, rather chilling. A timepiece that had been built never to tell time. A vessel that waited not to measure hours, but to conceal them. She said nothing, but in the corners of her mind, the gears had already begun to turn. In the days following Ambrose Rycroft's death, Little Darnsley resumed its customary rhythms, but with an added layer of hushed intrigue. Curtains shifted more often. Conversations that began with the weather veered, with genteel inevitability, toward speculation. For while death was not uncommon in such a village, the manner of Mr. Rycroft's passing, quiet, sudden, and surrounded by peculiarities, left behind not sorrow, but curiosity. Miss Marple, in her quiet way, had already begun what she called her mental knitting. It was a process built not upon suspicion, but pattern. She had, over years of living in St. Mary Mead and traveling among various relatives, grown familiar with the small rhythms of character that most overlooked. And in Little Darnsley, there were patterns forming already. At the grocer's there was mention of Mr. Rycroft's reclusive habits, yet a milk bottle had been found emptied before its usual time. At the post office, murmurs of a parcel sent abroad weeks before his death. No one knew to whom. And always, Miss Marple listened more to what was not said than to what was. Introductions were made with village propriety. A few names offered with warm hands, others with cool regard. Yet under each greeting was a private history, and behind each door, a quiet grievance or unspoken debt. And so, as the village carried on, cups poured, dogs walked, gates latched, Miss Marple observed. She had long known that truth rarely knocked. It slipped instead through the spaces left open by habit, grief, and gossip. And in Little Darnsley, those spaces were beginning to widen. What most saw as neighborly routine, she recognized as the gentle unfolding of secrets, long folded away. The village was beginning to speak, and Miss Marple, never one to intrude, had learned precisely how to listen. Mrs. Tamsin Rycroft carried herself with the unyielding grace of someone who had once known comfort, and now resided only in the memory of it. She lived in a modest cottage near the schoolhouse, the widow of Ambrose Rycroft's estranged brother, and a figure both respected and quietly resented for her severe manner and inflexible sense of decorum. Miss Marple observed her during a charitable luncheon, Tamsin's contributions measured, her remarks sparse, but never unconsidered. She spoke of Ambrose with a tone that balanced familial obligation and private disdain. "A man of precision," she said, stirring her tea without sugar, "and little else." There was in her voice a bitterness too carefully concealed to be recent. Miss Marple noted it without judgment. It was not uncommon, in her experience, for the wounds within a family to calcify beneath civility, and Tamsin Rycroft, though composed, wore her pride like a corset drawn a little too tightly. Her financial situation, too, had not escaped notice. Once regarded as comfortable, her circumstances had visibly declined. Miss Marple, who had a knife of frayed cuffs and repaired hems, understood the quiet economy of a woman still trying to maintain appearances. The talk of a missing will and of possible inheritance had not gone unnoticed in her presence, nor had the faint flicker that passed over her expression when the grandfather clock was mentioned. Some grief is loud and performative, but other kinds, the deeper sorts, often take the shape of entitlement denied. Miss Marple, ever attentive, understood this distinction perfectly. Miss Clara Birch, a spinster of advancing years and fierce opinions, held court from a vine-strangled armchair in her cluttered parlor. She had known Mr. Rycroft since before his mustache came in properly, and considered herself an authority on his character, though she confessed he was a difficult man to know, even for someone of my tenacity. It was during a gently guided visit, one of Miss Marple's signature acts of social diplomacy, that Clara revealed something of unexpected interest. With the calculated pause of someone who well understood the currency of gossip, she mentioned a visitor, a young woman, seen entering Rycroft's workshop in early spring. "She didn't use the front door," Clara said with the pleased expression of one recounting a detail, long verified. "I saw her come down the alley beside the greengrocer's. Brown hair, about 25, well-dressed, not a local girl. Spoke to no one." Miss Marple nodded gently, her knitting resting in her lap. That such a visitor had not been spoken of in the wake of Rycroft's death was peculiar. More peculiar still was Clara's memory of seeing the girl again, weeks later, leaving the village with a valise and a veil drawn low. "She had tears in her eyes," Clara whispered, more to herself than to her guest. Miss Marple offered a kindly smile. It was not the detail of the girl's appearance that interested her, nor even the timing of her departure. It was the emotion Clara had noticed, so rarely remembered by those who watch, and yet so revealing when recalled. Colonel Halbert had lived in Little Donsley for nearly a decade, his retired military manner intact and unapologetically visible. He was the sort of man who treated even a garden gate with the deference of military protocol and believed firmly in matters being seen to. His interactions with the late Ambrose Rycroft had been few, but not without friction. The most public of these had occurred 3 years prior, when the colonel accused Rycroft of deliberately sabotaging the restoration of an antique mantel clock, an heirloom passed down through his wife's side. The matter had reached the magistrate's office, though never the courtroom, and simmered ever since. Miss Marple, having encountered many such men in her years, knew better than to take his temper at face value. It was pride wounded long ago that barked through his gruff tones, not genuine wrath. But pride, she also knew, could drive a man to folly, especially when it was coupled with suspicion and the faintest whiff of scandal. It was during a casual visit to the greengrocer's that the first murmurings of a missing will began to surface. Mrs. Pendle, whose hearing was sharp despite protestations otherwise, claimed she overheard Clara Birch mention that Ambrose had intended to set things right before the chime stopped. The phrase, peculiar and poetic, lodged in Miss Marple's mind. It bore the rhythm of something once said in private, and now passed through the sieve of gossip. A will, if it ever existed, had not been found. But the phrase lingered, its meaning uncertain, but clearly not accidental. And the colonel, who had spoken so freely of betrayal, had also mentioned, rather pointedly, that not all inheritances were earned. His eyes at the time had rested not on Miss Marple, but on Mrs. Tamsin Rycroft. The clock in question had become something of a village legend. Children whispered of it, adults speculated, yet none could say with certainty when it had last ticked. It was beautiful, to be sure, ornate and commanding, carved from dark walnut, and standing nearly as tall as a man. But Miss Marple was not interested in its appearance. Her eyes, rather, were drawn to the floor. She had always believed that wood, like conscience, records what it endures. And in the polish of the shop's floorboards, she noticed faint crescent scuffs just beyond the base of the clock, arcs made not by time or footsteps, but by careful dragging. The clock had been moved, and not recently. The marks were fresh, too clean to be from general wear. It puzzled her. For who, save Ambrose, would have the reason or the strength to move such a cumbersome piece? And why go to the trouble when the clock itself no longer functioned? She ran a gloved hand gently along the brass hinge, noting the absence of dust within the crevice. Someone had tampered with it, whether to hide something or retrieve something remained unclear. But one thing was certain. That clock had secrets within it, and someone had known precisely where to look. Edwin Flett was a young man of awkward posture and restless hands, the sort of youth who answered before being asked and often contradicted himself in the process. He had worked under Mr. Rycroft's tutelage for nearly 6 months, learning the delicate art of balance springs and escapements with a reverence that bordered on obsession. Miss Marple encountered him near the parish hall and engaged him in gentle conversation. She spoke of clocks, of cogs and calibrations, allowing the boy to relax under the comfort of shared interest. But when she steered the topic, ever so lightly, towards the movement of the grandfather clock, Edwin's demeanor shifted. He became fidgety, his gaze flickering toward the ground. When Miss Marple inquired whether Ambrose had worked on it in recent weeks, Edwin hesitated. Then, without warning, he muttered something about an errand and made to leave, too hastily. In his haste, he dropped something from his coat pocket, a small, intricate gear, unlike those used in ordinary timepieces. Miss Marple retrieved it quietly after he had vanished down the lane. The brass was polished, its teeth unblemished, and on its underside were engraved 2 initials, AR. The object was not simply mechanical, it was personal, and its sudden appearance was, to Miss Marple's mind, deeply telling. It was during a modest gathering for tea in the vicarage garden, a setting long favored by Miss Marple for its gentle revelations, that the name Millie Cartwright first arose. The conversation had drifted to the subject of old romances, as such things do when widows speak of the price of sugar, and then, without warning, fall into reminiscence. It was Mrs. Langley, the apothecary's widow, who lowered her voice with that delicious mix of mischief and pity, and said, "Poor Ambrose. Never quite the same after Milly." The story unfolded in careful fragments. Milly Cartwright had been engaged to Ambrose Rycroft in his youth. An uncharacteristic match, many agreed, for he had always struck them as emotionally frugal. She was said to be vivacious, artistic, and entirely unsuited to the quiet tedium of horology. And yet for a season they were inseparable. A marriage was announced, invitations printed. Then quite suddenly, she disappeared. Not in the scandalous sense of running off with another man, though whispers certainly abounded. She had simply gone, first to visit a cousin in Wiltshire, and then, as the years passed, to vanish altogether. No explanation was ever given. Ambrose resumed his work at the clock shop, a shade more withdrawn, and never again spoke her name. Miss Marple stirred her tea in thoughtful silence. She had learned long ago that the absences in a person's story often held more weight than their inclusions. A vanished fiancé, a sealed clock, and a man who had devoted himself to the illusion of order. There was, she felt, an emotional discord hidden beneath the ticking surface of Ambrose's life. It was not Milly's disappearance that troubled her. It was how thoroughly the village had agreed to forget her. It was not long after this conversation that Miss Marple paid another visit to the late Mr. Rycroft's workshop, ostensibly to collect a parasol left behind during the solicitor's inspection. She lingered, of course, with the quiet patience of one who rarely searched and yet always found. It was among a set of small drawers, each filled with brass cogs, springs, and delicately filed keys, that she discovered a photograph. It had fallen behind a cracked leather portfolio, its edges curled and its gloss long faded. The image showed a young woman, light-featured, slender, and dressed in a style some decades out of use, standing beside the grandfather clock. Her hand rested on the case with the intimacy of someone who had waited beside it before. There was no inscription, but the eyes, Miss Marple thought, were unmistakably Milly's. The resemblance matched the memory offered by Mrs. Langley, and perhaps more tellingly, matched nothing in Ambrose's visible life. The photograph had been kept but hidden, preserved not for display, but for secrecy. What struck Miss Marple most, however, was the clock itself. In the photograph, the door hung slightly ajar, revealing a brass pendulum mid-swing, a working timepiece, alive with motion. And now, a silent shell. She tucked the photograph delicately into her handbag, not to conceal but to protect, for it confirmed what she had long suspected. The grandfather clock had once marked time not only in hours, but in emotion, and someone, quite deliberately, had stopped both. When Miss Marple mentioned Milly Cartwright's name in casual conversation with Mrs. Tamsin Rycroft, the reaction was immediate, and cold enough to chill the air between them. Tamsin stiffened, her mouth forming the sort of expression typically reserved for sour milk or improper lace. "That girl," she said, "was nothing but trouble. Better left forgotten." It was not the words themselves that interested Miss Marple, but the sharpness with which they were delivered. Tamsin, for all her composure and clipped speech, had revealed something quite unguarded. Resentment, yes, but also a trace of fear. Not of Milly, precisely, but of what Milly had represented. Disruption, uncertainty, and, perhaps worst of all, an inheritance of sentiment that could not be rationalized or controlled. Miss Marple made no argument. She had learned over time that those who fear the past most are often those with something deeply invested in it, And in Tamsin's case there was much to protect: her dignity, her household, and possibly her tenuous claim upon the Rycroft name. What puzzled Miss Marple most, however, was not Tamsin's hostility, but her assumption of authority. She spoke not as a distant relative, but as a woman who had once fought for dominance over Ambrose's affections, or, failing that, his legacy. Milly had been loved, and Tamsin had known it. In Miss Marple's experience, bitterness was rarely born of indifference. It came almost invariably from the ache of comparison. And Tamsin's tone, for all its disdain, sounded very much like envy turned brittle with age. Edwin Flett had the sort of nervous disposition that lent itself poorly to scrutiny. His eyes shifted like dials left uncalibrated, and his hands, perpetually ink-stained from clock grease, were rarely at rest. He had worked part-time under Mr. Rycroft for just under 2 years, a timid but well-meaning lad, whose loyalty was unquestioned, and whose silence was often mistaken for simplicity. Miss Marple, however, had long since learned that the quiet ones often saw more than they let on. It was during a carefully worded conversation, delivered not as interrogation but as gentle reminiscence, that Edwin confessed something unusual. Not with bravado, nor even with remorse, but with the weary relief of someone no longer able to carry the burden of discretion. Some months prior, Ambrose had instructed Edwin to assist with modifications to the base of the grandfather clock. It wasn't that Edwin had noted a repair job. Rather, it was a deliberate construction, an interior recess cleverly built into the pendulum cavity and masked beneath a false panel. Ambrose had worked on it only during closed hours and had sworn Edwin to secrecy. "Not everything," he'd muttered once, "needs to be wound to be remembered." At the time, Edwin thought little of it. But after the clockmaker's death and the growing whispers about a missing will, the memory returned with unsettling clarity. Edwin had not dared open the compartment himself, but he had watched Ambrose seal something inside, carefully wrapped, handwritten, and reverently placed. It was not mechanics he was burying, but memory. And now, with the man gone, and the clock standing hollow, Edwin was beginning to wonder if the silence it held was less accidental than protective. It was with this knowledge that Miss Marple, under the unobtrusive pretense of examining the workshop's contents for the vicar's charity sale, paid particular attention to the base of the grandfather clock. She did not search it openly. Such things were never her way, but let her fingers linger along the woodwork, tracing the grooves and imperfections others might dismiss. Eventually her touch found a seam where none ought to be, and with the press of a thumb, the panel shifted. Inside there was no will, not yet, but a single folded scrap of aged paper, creased many times over. Upon it, in Ambrose's unmistakably austere hand, were the words, "When the chime is silent, the truth begins." Miss Marple read it twice, though once would have sufficed. It was not a confession nor an explanation, but a riddle meant for someone who understood the clockmaker's peculiar habits. He had built time for others, but guarded his own secrets in silence. She tucked the note away, not with urgency, but with calm purpose. The message, she felt, was not merely symbolic. It was a directive. And whatever Ambrose Rycroft had hidden, be it truth, guilt, or legacy, it had been meant to be found. That night, as wind rattled the loose gutters and the church bell struck the late hour, the peace of Little Darnsley was broken by an unusual event. A break-in at the clock shop, clumsy, forceful, and distinctly uncharacteristic for a village where theft typically involved biscuits or bicycles. By morning, word had spread. The constable, baffled by the disorder, reported that several clocks had been smashed, deliberately so. Small ones mostly. Mantelpieces, carriage clocks, and 2 ornate cuckoos, all left in ruin. Tools were overturned, drawers rifled through, nothing taken of obvious value. All except the grandfather clock. It remained untouched, not even a fingerprint on its varnished face. Miss Marple arrived shortly after the constable had finished his statements, and true to form, asked nothing directly. But she noted the glass shards swept neatly into the corner, and the strange absence of dust near the base of the long case clock, as though someone had knelt there recently. It was not the act of a thief, it was the panic of someone searching for something specific, something they feared had already been found. And so, as the village clucked its tongue and speculated, Miss Marple considered a different question entirely. Who had broken in, not to steal, but to ensure a secret stayed buried? News of Miss Clara Birch's death passed through the village with a peculiar hush, less the stir of tragedy, and more the reverberation of unease. She had been found by her charwoman, seated in her parlor chair, a shawl draped over her knees, and a half-finished letter on the side table. The tea in her cup remained undrunk, and her spectacles lay slightly askew. It was, at first glance, a scene of natural repose. But the constable, who had grown increasingly cautious in light of recent happenings, requested a post-mortem. The results unsettled even those with a natural taste for village drama. Digitalis, administered in a fatal dose, almost certainly within her evening tea. There were other disquieting details. Her fireplace poker, a heavy iron piece with a polished handle, was missing, though the fire had not been lit. More curiously still, her diary, which she was known to write in with obsessive regularity, could not be found. Not a single volume, neither current nor past. Miss Marple, informed discreetly by her niece's friend, did not react with surprise but with solemn resignation. Clara Birch had been by nature a gatherer of information, a keeper of memories both private and publicly inconvenient. And though some found her nosiness tiresome, Miss Marple had always regarded her with a quiet appreciation. People who observed often stored the most useful truths. Now Clara's own story had been brought to a sharp and final full stop. But for Miss Marple, the absence of the diary said more than its pages ever could. Someone had wanted Clara silent, not only in voice, but in recollection. And when a woman is murdered not for what she has done, but for what she remembers, then the truth, inevitably, draws nearer. Only a day before her sudden death, Clara Birch had taken a small but deliberate walk to the vicarage, where Miss Marple happened to be attending an afternoon reading of devotional verse. It was during the polite lull after the tea had been poured that Clara had leaned in, and with a conspiratorial whisper, said she believed she remembered something important about the girl in the photograph. She had not needed to specify which photograph. Miss Marple, ever attuned to the subtle convergences of conversation, knew at once that she referred to the image of Millie Cartwright, the faded portrait beside the grandfather clock, now safely tucked in Miss Marple's handbag. I knew there was something odd, Clara had said, her voice hushed. A connection I missed. It's come back to me now. But I'll need to check my old notes first. But the notes, if they existed, were never shared. And the memory Clara had so nearly retrieved had died with her, buried beneath the ambiguous silence of unspoken truths. Miss Marple considered the coincidence, if coincidence it was, of such timing. Clara had confided something, even in part, and within hours her voice had been forever extinguished. The girl in the photograph, her presence, her departure, her link to Ambrose. All were questions Clara had brushed against like cobwebs in an attic. Miss Marple, with that calm patience cultivated over years of quietly studying human nature, now understood that Clara had come perilously close to knowing too much. The morning after Clara's passing, Miss Marple was invited to assist with organizing her personal effects, a courtesy extended by the vicar's wife, who believed it helpful to have a gentle and observant pair of hands. It was there, among the patterned cushions and meticulously dusted mantelpiece, that Miss Marple noticed something most out of character. Clara's parlor, so often crowded with crocheted doilies and stacks of old magazines, had been freshly tidied. The rug had been straightened, the curtains drawn back evenly, and a second teacup rested on the tray, unused but waiting. Clara had been expecting a guest. That small, quiet truth unraveled more than a dozen speculations. She had cleaned, set out tea, and arranged her papers with deliberation. This was no spontaneous visit. It had been anticipated. And the missing diary, likely intended for that very meeting. Miss Marple traced her hand over the arm of the parlor chair, and imagined Clara sitting where she always did, half-tilted in conversation, relishing the knowledge that she knew something others did not. But in this case, her anticipation had cost her dearly. Miss Marple straightened a napkin that had shifted ever so slightly, and thought, with considerable gravity, that someone had been here under the guise of conversation, and left having committed murder. Among those who reacted most vocally to Clara's death was Colonel Halbert. His outrage was blusterous, his concern verging on theatrical, and his insistence on the necessity of swift justice rather more fervent than the occasion perhaps required. Miss Marple had long understood that men of a certain temperament often reacted most intensely when proximity made them uncomfortable. Guilt did not always take the form of remorse. It often arrived first as indignation. The colonel had claimed he had been at home the night in question, nursing a sore ankle and reading back issues of The Field. No one had seen him, but that was not unusual. He had no close companions in the village, and his interactions were largely limited to the weekly rifle club and the occasional village fete. But Miss Marple, who had taken a leisurely walk near the birch cottage that very evening, recalled something quite distinctly. Outside Clara's parlor window had been a series of deep impressions in the damp soil, boot prints of a very particular make, military issue, and the heel bore a distinctive notch that matched the colonel's polished boots exactly. She had said nothing at the time, but now she quietly made note of it. And she remembered, too, that Colonel Halbert had once had a legal dispute with Ambrose Rycroft, years ago, over a faulty regulator that had cost him a racing wager. Small grievances, like poorly wound clocks, tended to unravel when left untended. Miss Marple made no accusations, not yet. But she knew well that when a man protests too loudly, it is often not justice he seeks, but diversion. It was during a subdued walk through the churchyard that Edwin Flett, flanked by his usual hesitancy, let slip something of interest. His words were clumsy, filtered through nerves and the weight of recent events. But Miss Marple received them with her customary calm. Clara Birch, he said, had once been Millie Cartwright's closest friend. It was not a fact that had surfaced before. Edwin had learned of it not through direct conversation, but from a letter Clara had once lent him to copy for safekeeping. The letter, unsigned and undated, had been addressed to Dearest M. It spoke with affection, but also with anguish, of decisions regretted, silences kept too long, and the unbearable weight of secrets shared in trust. Clara had, according to Edwin, always believed that Ambrose had wronged Milly, perhaps not with cruelty, but with cowardice. There had been talk once of a disagreement, a confrontation witnessed by no one, but felt by many. Miss Marple walked slowly, as Edwin recounted what little else he remembered. Clara, he said, had never forgiven Ambrose. She spoke of him rarely, but when she did, it was with a bitterness that even time had not softened. It was not only grief that lingered in Clara's rooms, Miss Marple now realized, but the echo of loyalty to a friend long gone, and a truth half buried by those too proud to speak it. Later that week, under the guise of examining the neglected rear garden of the clock shop, Miss Marple bent to inspect a patch of disturbed earth beside the privet. A gardener's instinct had guided her there. A subtle change in the symmetry of the soil, a rose bush that had been recently staked but not yet in bloom. What she unearthed was small, worn and heavy with memory. A silver pocket watch, its chain snapped, its casing streaked with rust. And something else. Blood. Faint but unmistakable, dried and crusted near the hinge. There were no initials, no inscription. Only the quiet suggestion of a story abruptly halted. Miss Marple turned the watch over in her gloved hand and considered the weight of time. Not in minutes or hours, but in the quiet choices people make when no one is watching. It was not a murder weapon, but a message left unspoken, perhaps buried in haste, perhaps out of shame, or perhaps, like everything else in this mystery, it was planted. She returned the watch to her handbag, her face thoughtful, her pace unhurried, for the pieces were falling into place, not in grand gestures but in quiet echoes. And in little Darnsley, time, once again, was beginning to speak. It was not in a safe nor tucked neatly in a drawer, marked legal matters. It was behind the clock, of course, where time itself had been hushed into secrecy. The discovery came not through force, but through patience. Miss Marple had long known that the most significant documents were rarely where solicitors expected them to be, especially when guilt or shame had preceded them. The grandfather clock, long sealed and emptied of its expected inner workings, had offered only riddles thus far. But Miss Marple, armed with Edwin's confession and the cryptic note scrawled by Ambrose himself, had paid a final visit to the old timepiece. Her fingers, precise and unhurried, traced the curvature of the inner casing until the mechanism clicked free with the faintest protest of wood against brass. There, folded with the same precision one might use for a monogrammed handkerchief, lay a parchment envelope, yellowed at the edges and bound with twine. The contents bore the unmistakable hand of Ambrose Rycroft, stiff, formal, emotionally cautious even in ink. It was his final will and testament, witnessed and signed, dated 3 months before his death. But what caught Miss Marple's eye was not merely the name of the beneficiary. It was the deliberate care with which the letter had been placed, not filed, but hidden. Ambrose had wanted the truth to be found, but not prematurely. Only when silence had passed would the ticking begin again. Miss Marple read it through twice, not because she doubted its contents, but because the name written within had already taken root in her thoughts. The name on the will, Amelia Carter, was unfamiliar to most, but not to Miss Marple. It was a name Clara Birch had mentioned in passing before her death, and one that had surfaced in a letter sent to the vicar's wife by a quiet young woman, hoping to learn something of her mother's past. According to the document, Amelia was the sole heir to Ambrose's estate. The will made no mention of Tamsin Rycroft, nor of any distant relatives. It spoke instead of the child born of Millie Cartwright, whom I once wronged through cowardice and silence. There had been no public acknowledgment of such a daughter, of course. In villages such as Little Darnsley, secrets like that were left asleep beneath years of politeness and omission. But the handwriting was clear, the intention unmistakable. Miss Marple recalled the details carefully. Amelia had arrived in the village just weeks before Ambrose's death, staying quietly in a rented room near the green, under a different name, asking no direct questions, but writing notes in a small leather-bound book. Few had noticed her. Fewer still had realized her significance. But Ambrose had known. And in naming her his heir, he had chosen to unfasten the truth long locked away, not only about Millie, but about his own failings as a man who once loved and failed to act with honor. The past had returned, not in vengeance, but in fragile hope. Amelia Carter's visit to Little Darnsley had been brief, discreet, and conducted with the sort of caution that comes from having been warned, if not explicitly, then by experience. She had written ahead, a simple letter addressed to the parish office, stating that she sought information concerning one Millie Cartwright, formerly of this village, whose name may appear in local recollections. No return address was given. She had stayed in a modest room above the stationer's shop, and had made few acquaintances. But she had visited the clock shop once, quietly, on a rainy afternoon, when fewer people were likely to be about. Miss Marple, who had pieced this together from the postmistress's recollection and the vicar's wife's brief encounter, understood that Amelia had not come in pursuit of property or lineage. She had come to understand the silence that had shrouded her birth, to find out why her mother had vanished, why her name had been erased. What she had found, it seemed, was not confrontation, but acknowledgment. Ambrose had received her. He had not turned her away. And afterward, perhaps stirred by her resemblance to Millie or by the weight of his own guilt, he had made the changes to the clock, rewritten his will, and begun, at last, to confront the past he had buried so carefully. But someone else in the village had noticed Amelia too. And as Miss Marple reflected on Clara Birch's warning and the haste of her death, she suspected that Amelia's presence had reawakened more than memory. It had stirred fear, tucked alongside the will, folded and written in a markedly different hand, more fluid, more confessional, was a personal letter, not addressed to Amelia, nor intended for legal eyes. It was a letter Ambrose Rycroft had written for no one but himself, though he had left it where it would eventually be found. It spoke of regret, not in dramatic flourishes, but in the quiet terms of a man who had thought too long and spoken too little. He admitted to turning Millie away when she had needed him most, admitted that pressure from his elder brother, Tamsin's husband, had convinced him that marriage to a woman of no fortune and uncertain background would jeopardize the family's standing. He wrote that Millie had come to him, frightened and with child, and that he, ashamed and uncertain, had refused her, not cruelly, he claimed, but firmly, respectably, as one is expected to behave. It was only years later he confessed. that the weight of his decision began to gnaw at him. The clocks no longer gave him peace. Their ticking became an accusation. And so he had searched for Amelia, found her, and tried, however belatedly, to offer something in return. But guilt, Miss Marple knew, does not pass quietly. It echoes, long after time is meant to mend. It was not a formal inquest, nor a legal assembly, but rather a quiet gathering requested by Miss Marple in the drawing-room of the Rycroft residence. The invitation had been extended without force, and received with the polite reluctance that attends such unexpected summons in English villages. Mrs. Tamsin Rycroft had arrived first, her expression composed but with a tightness at the corners of her mouth. Colonel Halbert followed, his walking stick striking the floor with more certainty than his words ever managed. Edwin Flett sat near the door, pale and awkward, his fingers twisting a handkerchief into delicate knots. And lastly, the solicitor, Mr. Gibbons, took a seat with a folder on his lap, uncertain of what was expected, but unwilling to seem absent should matters turn to inheritance. Miss Marple, in her usual soft manner, made no dramatic pronouncements. She merely expressed a wish to clarify certain events that had troubled her. Troubled, she said, not as a matter of curiosity, but of conscience. She placed the will gently upon the table, beside it the faded photograph of Millie Cartwright, and the letter in Ambrose's own hand. Not all present recognized the weight of those objects, but one did. The silence that followed was not awkward, but anticipatory. Miss Marple, with her hands neatly folded, looked not at the items, but at the people gathered around them. And then, with the gentlest conviction, she began. Miss Marple began not with accusation, but with recollection. She retraced the days leading to Ambrose Rycroft's death, not in grand detail, but with the kind of quiet precision that makes gaps painfully apparent. She noted that Ambrose, long withdrawn, had been seen in recent weeks writing letters, disposing of old ledgers, and commissioning changes to the grandfather clock. Tasks not characteristic of a man preparing for many more years of life. Edwin confirmed these habits, his voice uncertain but sincere. She reminded the group that Amelia Carter had arrived quietly in the village shortly before his death, and had, by all accounts, met with Ambrose. The meeting was not public, but the timing of the revised will, now discovered in the hollow of the clock, pointed unmistakably to its consequence. Miss Marple then turned to Clara Birch. Clara had mentioned, mere hours before her demise, that she recalled something about the girl in the photograph. Something from years past. She had cleaned her parlor, set out tea, and expected a guest. She was silenced. Miss Marple said simply, before her memory could speak. She glanced next to Colonel Halbert, whose muddy boot print had matched precisely the pattern she had found beneath Clara's parlor window. But not all silences are fatal, she added, and not all trespassers are murderers. Some are merely frightened men, more afraid of scandal than crime. At this the colonel shifted uncomfortably, but Miss Marple had already moved on. The clock, she continued, had been broken not by time or accident, but by intention. A search had been made, not for gold, but for guilt. And in the quiet aftermath, only one person had motive enough to want both Ambrose and Clara removed from the path of truth. Tamsin, Miss Marple said so gently it almost sounded like a kindness. You feared losing what little remained. Tamsin Rycroft did not respond at first. Her expression remained fixed, her eyes locked on the will that lay between them like a fissure. But in that stillness, Miss Marple read the truth, as surely as if it had been written in ink. You had built your identity, your standing, on what little the Rycroft name still offered. You lived in modest comfort, yes, but you wore the dignity of that name like a medal earned through endurance. Then came this girl, Amelia, a stranger, illegitimate, unannounced. She would inherit all that remained. The others looked on in silence as Miss Marple continued, not cruelly, but with that unrelenting clarity reserved for those who speak in truths long unspoken. When Ambrose died, you assumed there would be no scandal, no mention of Millie, no child. But Clara had seen Amelia, and Clara remembered far too much, so you visited her, pretended civility, and silenced her. Tamsin's face did not crumble, nor did her voice break. When she finally spoke, it was not denial, but defense. I had nothing, she said quietly. I gave my whole life to a name, to a house filled with dust and clocks and obligations. Miss Marple did not answer. She understood far too well that pride can sour into desperation. Tamsin, she said softly, you killed not from hatred, but from fear. And that, she added, is a motive as old as any. No one moved. The silence ticked on like a clock newly wound. But the truth had found its chime. And Tamsin, who had feared losing everything, now found herself without even the comfort of concealment. The method, Miss Marple continued, had always been simple, simple enough to pass beneath suspicion. Ambrose had trusted Tamsin in the way older men often trusted those they found familiar and non-threatening. She had brought him tea on occasion, perhaps under the pretense of kindness or of familial obligation. Into one of those cups, unmarked, unremarkable, she had slipped digitalis, enough to still the heart, yet leave little trace in the body of a man already perceived as fragile. But it was not the poison that revealed her. It was the aftermath. Tamsin had returned after his death, when the house stood quiet, and the solicitor had yet to arrive. She searched the workshop. She opened drawers, overturned ledgers, shifted furniture. But the will, hidden in the hollow of the clock, eluded her. In her frustration, she moved the clock from its place, unaware of the faint trail she left across the wooden floorboards. A scratch, a smudge, a tiny shift in symmetry. Enough for Miss Marple's eyes to detect. She had assumed the matter would rest. But then Amelia returned, then Clara remembered, then finally, the ticking began. What Tamsin had tried to bury had, like guilt itself, refused to stay silent. The truth, Miss Marple thought, has its own rhythm, and even clocks, when hollowed of their purpose, retain the echo of time once told. Faced with the reawakening of Clara's memory and the mounting threat it posed, Tamsin acted again. This time the act was bolder. Clara, alone and trusting, had expected conversation. Instead, she received a visitor bearing poisoned intentions. Afterwards, to mask the nature of the act, Tamsin removed Clara's diary, a record likely filled with sharp observations and inconvenient truths. She took the poker, not as a weapon, but to avoid its use as evidence. And she left behind a parlor too neat, too prepared, to be mistaken for natural solitude. But fear lingered. Clara's death had stirred more questions than it stilled. So Tamsin, in desperation, turned to misdirection. She broke into the clock shop under cover of night. She shattered smaller timepieces, ransacked drawers, scattered tools, all to simulate a crime of theft or revenge. But the grandfather clock remained untouched, perhaps from fear of what still lay hidden, or perhaps from the knowledge that it had already failed to give up its secrets. Yet the villagers had lived too long, with truth concealed behind appearances. The break-in drew attention, not away, but further in. And Miss Marple, who knew that false disorder often conceals the most precise intentions, saw through it all. There remained only one object left unspoken: the bloodied pocket watch, unearthed behind the clock shop's flower bed. It had not belonged to Ambrose, nor to Edwin, nor to any of the usual suspects. It had been Millie's, her gift long ago, given to her by Ambrose in the early days of their courtship. The initials inside, MC, had faded, but not disappeared. Edwin, sorting through a forgotten box weeks earlier, had found it tucked among old rags. He had sensed its value but not its meaning. When Ambrose realized the will had been stolen, or might be, he had buried the watch himself, not to discard it but to preserve it. It was a symbol perhaps of regret, of promises broken, of a life he had once imagined and then, through cowardice, allowed to wither. Tamsin had found it after his death, perhaps hoping it would lead her to more. But instead it led to blood, on her gloves, on the casing, on her conscience. She could hide the diary, but not the stains the past had left behind. Miss Marple held the pocket watch gently and turned it once in her palm. The ticking had long ceased, but its message, like truth itself, had not faded. It had merely waited. When the constable arrived with two plain-clothed men from the county, there was no struggle, no protestation, no display of innocence or rage. Tamsin Rycroft opened the door herself, her expression composed, her shoulders squared. She asked only for a moment to collect her gloves, which she did with the same grace she had worn at every garden fete and village committee meeting over the years. There were those who whispered she must have been in shock, or that her silence was born of guilt. But Miss Marple, who had witnessed many endings and many varieties of shame, understood differently. Tamsin's stillness was not that of collapse but of containment. A woman who had chosen pride over confession, and now clutched what fragments of dignity remained like pearls on a thread. She offered no apology, not to Amelia, nor to Edwin, nor to the community she had deceived. She simply allowed herself to be taken, her final glance not toward the clock shop or the house, but toward the unbloomed rosebush at the back of the garden, a place where a pocket watch had once been buried and later unearthed. Miss Marple said nothing as she watched her go. There was no need for commentary. The moment did not require judgment, only understanding. And when the constable tipped his hat to her out of habit, she nodded softly, as though the turning of events had been not dramatic, but inevitable. Time, after all, waits for no woman. Amelia Carter accepted the solicitor's formal notice with the quietness that had characterized her from the beginning. She did not linger at the property, nor did she feign sentiment for a place she had never called home. The house and clock shop, left untouched since the events of recent weeks, passed to her as outlined in the will. The paperwork was filed, the keys were handed over, the furniture inventory completed. But it was clear to Miss Marple, and to anyone observant enough to notice, that Amelia's mind was already elsewhere. The village, with its winding lanes and watchful hedges, had served its purpose. It had answered the questions she had carried for years, but it could not offer her roots where none had been planted. She arranged to sell the property through the solicitor's office, made plans to return to her modest teaching post in Surrey. and offered a courteous farewell to those who had extended her civility during her brief stay. To Edwin Flett, she left a note of thanks, kindly worded though not intimate, and to Miss Marple, a letter folded within a small envelope containing the photograph of Millie beside the grandfather clock. "I think she would have liked you," it said, in a hand gentle but steady. It was on the morning after Amelia's departure that Miss Marple took her customary walk through the garden, basket in hand, secateurs folded neatly in her pocket. The roses, though not yet in full bloom, showed signs of resilience, buds tucked in tight, as if unwilling to expose themselves too soon. She paused at the rear, where the flower bed had once held more than roots. The soil had been freshly turned and replanted, the signs of disruption now hidden beneath careful trowel work and new mulch. But memory, Miss Marple knew, was not so easily covered. The truth, once uncovered, had rippled through little Darnsley in the same way a sudden frost unsettles spring blossoms, gently but definitively. Some had been surprised, others quietly vindicated. A few had revised their recollections of Tamsin, painting her now as either tragic or tyrannical, depending on how fond they had been of her lemon curd or her charitable donations. But Miss Marple did not concern herself with reputations. She thought instead of the strange architecture of human guilt, how it lodged itself not always in crimes of passion, but in daily compromises, how a silence chosen years ago could echo into present sorrow. She reflected too on clocks, their outward sameness, their inner mechanisms, each one calibrated to a maker's design, and yet so often taken for granted, until they stopped. And as she trimmed a faded bloom from a shrub near the sundial, she considered how time, for all its constancy, had its secrets. Some ticked quietly, unnoticed. Others waited like seeds in the soil for the hour to strike. That afternoon the vicar's wife brought round a sponge cake and a fresh tin of Ceylon. The kettle was boiled, cups laid out, and the conversation meandered once more toward the topics more suitable to polite society. Rhubarb yields, postal delays, and the peculiar noise coming from the church organ bellows. Yet beneath the renewed rhythm of village life, something subtle had shifted. There was a pause now, a beat of thought, before names were spoken or stories repeated. Secrets had been revealed, and in their wake, discretion had grown its own new roots. Miss Marple, pouring tea with a practiced hand, allowed herself a moment of gentle reflection. Not on justice, which had come in its own measured pace, but on understanding. Tamsin had feared obscurity. Clara had cherished memory. Ambrose had mourned too late. And Amelia, quiet, persistent Amelia, had emerged from all of it, not triumphant, but whole. As the vicar's wife reached for another slice of cake, Miss Marple glanced once more at the photograph Amelia had returned to her. Millie's eyes, half turned from the camera, seemed to gaze at something just beyond the frame. "It is curious," Miss Marple murmured almost to herself, "how many secrets tick away just behind the silence." And with that, the clock struck 4. And so, the grandfather clock that once stood silent now holds a very different kind of stillness. Not one of secrets buried, but of truth finally told. In the quiet village of Little Darnsley, where time had once been stopped by guilt and guarded pride, Miss Marple's gentle wisdom allowed it to tick again. It wasn't just about a murder, or a will, or a pocket watch stained by the past. It was about the subtle choices that people make, to hide, to protect, to forget. and how those choices ripple across years. Ambrose tried to make amends too late. Tamsin clung to a name that never truly offered her love. And Clara died with her memories, because someone feared them. But perhaps the most enduring moment is not in the arrest or the reveal, but in the garden, where Miss Marple quietly reflects. Some secrets tick softly. And that concludes today's journey into the shadows of mystery and deduction. What did you think of this case? Did you see the twist coming, or did it catch you by surprise? Share your theories and favorite moments in the comments below. Love to hear your take. And if you're craving more thrilling detective tales, don't forget to like this video, subscribe, and hit the bell so you never miss the next mystery. Until then, stay curious. The next clue might be closer than you think.